Fragments of a discussion about Hegel's philosophy of right. Fragment 1. We use purpose to talk about the intention that we have with an activity. So the inner side of our directedness toward a certain goal. So if I have a purpose, it has become an obnoxious example, but if we talk about drinking a cup of coffee, so the cup of coffee is the object. Fragment 2. But so the purpose is to drink it, right? And the impulse is my thirst, and the object obviously is the cup of coffee itself. And there's more to it because I also have to make the coffee or get the coffee here somehow, and that would mean that there are several acts of volition working together to realize my final goal, because I also have to want all the different steps, the means. That is the fourth. You have purpose, you have object, you have impulse, and you have the means. Now the means can be a series of acts that in themselves also require an act of the free will. So my purpose is to get up in order to realize a secondary purpose, to move toward the room where I keep the coffee, and then the third act and the fourth act. All of that are subordinate to the original and major idea that I get myself a cup of coffee because I'm thirsty. So they are subordinate because they are not desirable in themselves, but they are desirable only with regard to some other desire that for me is the major one. You can describe the psychological side of human volition by these four characteristics: purpose, object, desire, and means. There you have it. And as Hegel says, the only thing you're left with is the notion of accidental or arbitrary freedom. Fragment 3. I think it's a common sense psychology in a way. It's just what you find by an immediate reflection upon yourself. So it's more like the analysis of conscious acts than it is the psychological reconstruction of the whole process of unconscious desires and motives, etc. That is what in the second half of the 19th century psychology developed into, with the discovery of the unconscious and the id, and how let's say our desires and impulses have a more or less autonomous causality, and that my conscious awareness of tendencies and impulses is not at all a true knowledge of them. So the knowledge of what drives me is not simply given in the consciousness of what drives me, because consciousness in a way is merely an echo or a derivation of those impulses. It's not the truth of those impulses. That's Freudian, right? And Hegel isn't there yet. He is saying that when I drink a cup of coffee and I think that I'm doing that because I'm thirsty, I'm perfectly right. And a psychiatrist, Freudian style, will say, well, wait a minute, why do you keep on choosing cups of coffee instead of cups of tea? That's not because you really like coffee. Come on now, there's something else going on. Did your mother by any chance drink coffee all the time, and your father drank tea, so it's in a way you're choosing for your mother instead of your father, etc., etc. I mean, that's, to Hegel that would be nonsensical, all of it. The whole idea that my desires and longings and impulses would have such an autonomous power within myself would contradict his notion of humans as truly spiritual beings. And he would agree that sometimes it can look like that, or that you can have this kind of view of oneself, but it would reduce the human soul to something quite mechanical, and it would certainly destroy the priority of our consciousness as something that we can rely on to give us truth, even if that truth is provisionary and has to be developed and is not fully true, if only rational at the first stage. It has to become speculative. Everything that Hegel says about that, of course, somehow makes our consciousness relative, makes our rationality relative, but not in the sense that it is a deception. He will never say that our rational faculty deceives us. It's not complete, but it's not a deception. And that is something that, along the lines of a Freudian psychology, we have to see all the time. It's merely something in disguise, it's merely symbolic, it's referring to some autonomous sphere of my inner being that I can't reach directly. I have to do it by explaining to Dr. Freud what I have dreamt just now, and he will apply it to my mother, and then we're finished. And then, of course, my self-esteem is destroyed. And it has become part and parcel of everyday culture. And I can't remember just now, but maybe I'll write about that later on. There's a famous discussion in the phenomenology about the kind of, I think it's in the chapter, the individuality that is to itself real, which I think, if read properly, can be a devastating critique of Freudian psychology. Because at that level of the development of the spirit, here's the individual that takes everything that it finds within itself or can construct as being interior to itself as the truth of its being, as its own reality. And why is that nonsense? Because there is no such thing as an individual reality. Our individual reality is socially determined, always connected to other beings. Let's say also mediated through language, etc., etc. So the whole idea that I can just look at something that is individual and describe its interior processes, to Hegel would be completely abstract. And of course then arbitrary. So. I think that it's called the individuality that is to and for itself real. Let me just look at fragment 4. And you have this form that you can fill with the content you more or less arbitrarily take from empirical science or from observation or something like that. Like your basic, your matrix in which you put all these data is flawed from the beginning. I think Hegel actually showed that, at least to my satisfaction, already in the introduction here in the Philosophy of Right. I've got the text, by the way. I've got the text. It's a chapter called Realization of Rational Self-Consciousness Through Itself. And it talks at the second stage, and then the first part of the second stage, about pleasure and necessity, the law of the heart, the frenzy of self-conceit, etc. So that is before spirit. It's part of the chapter on reason. So it is C, A, B, 2A. C, the free concrete mind, A, reason, B, realization of rational self-consciousness through itself, then 2, the converse process involved in this movement, the essential nature of morality, and then pleasure and necessity, the law of the heart, etc. I think that, but the rest, psychological laws is part of one of these chapters. The basic thing is that reason observes nature and develops a construction of its laws. And then it starts applying that kind of categories to itself. So that is the wonderful discovery. We can formulate natural law if A is here, then B will result from that. There is no arbitrariness to that, it's full necessity. And true knowledge is everything that you can describe with this law of causality or other natural laws, law of gravity and law of conservation of energy and all of that. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we have the same kind of certainty in the knowledge of ourselves? Let's say that we have a set of psychological laws. Now you come in and you complain about your own behavior because it doesn't seem right to you, and I can make some kind of I can have a theoretical understanding of what is wrong with you simply by applying these general laws that are valid for each and every one. Nothing unique about you. I don't have to discover what makes you tick and what happened to you, but simply I have this set of psychological laws. One of the funniest aberrations of that view was the craniology. So the doctrine that by measuring the size of your skull, you could make deductions about your intelligence and the like. I mean, it was very popular in the 19th century. So Hegel discussed all of that, and then he drew the conclusion that, in a way, spirit had become a skull at this stage, had become a bone. Der Geist war ein Knochen at this stage of development. Now, I've always thought that in Freudian psychology, this idea of law-like rules of explanation was very important. Freud wanted to make psychology into a scientific theory that could be demonstrated by experiment, by observation, and that had a set of rules for explanation, and derived from that a set of rules for treatment. So hysteria didn't become wasn't any longer very malicious label for a kind of female behavior that men didn't like, but it was suddenly a descriptive term for a condition that could be explained by general laws. And I think that is what it's all about, the enormous difference between this kind of natural reason, seeking natural explanations through natural laws, which then tries to define itself, define humanity as such in the same manner, which totally breaks down in the final chapter of that. And that is actually the high point of it all. Individuality which takes itself to be real in and for itself. So the high product, the highest product of this kind of reasoning is talking about the individual that is a world, a reality in itself and for itself. So I know myself to be a real thing, and I can explain myself. Not understand myself so much, but explain myself. See? Explanation means I can give an account of my individual being in general terms. I can use universal categories in law and laws to describe myself. So what am I? In this idea, I am a product of X, Y, Z, and I have developed through Fragment 5. I believe it's this. A lot of people read philosophical texts, especially these difficult ones by Hegel, and they do not seem to be aware that in many ways a philosophical text is like any text. That is to say, it's the expression of a writer's mind. It's a expression in language, and language has certain laws, and literature has certain laws that you discover when you do exegesis. My main Fragment 6 proficiency is in theological exegesis or biblical exegesis. So I'm taking a text and I'm taking it as literature. What is the genre? What is the way it's set up? I wrote 3 articles about reading Hegel as literature at the beginning of the notes that I wrote for Facebook. So you have to look at historical context, language, the genre that he obviously introduces at the beginning, and all of that helps us to decide what the text actually wants to do. And those are questions that most students of philosophy never ask. They simply take the text as a series of propositions, and they demand some kind of logical consistency, and they want some kind of progress in the development of an idea, but they don't see that there is a certain guy named Hegel who learned literary conventions and who knew how to write philosophy in his own way, had all these examples of other philosophers, and he's writing also philosophical literature. Fragment 7. In any paragraph there will be a kind of marker that indicates the way it connects to the next one. And those markers are never the same, and the relationship between subsequent paragraphs is never exactly the same. Especially not in the introduction, that does not try to give a logically coherent system. You don't have, you have some, of course, the form of dialectics here, paragraph 5, 6, 7 are an example of that, but look at the rest. From paragraph 8 on, even unto paragraph 19, we have a series of elucidations without inner logical connection. We have him moving from one idea to the other without being necessitated by the former to get there. Paragraph 5, 6, and 7, you might say, have some kind of dialectical stringency, some kind of dialectical necessity. But that's completely gone in paragraph 10, where he simply says, analytically, well, this is what we found, and this is also in here, this is also implicitly in here. He can do that in an introduction. He can't do that in the main body of the text, where he has to use logical necessity. But he does that in the introduction, the same way in the Vorrede, in the phenomenology. He goes from one topic to another. There's no dialectical development there. Even in the introduction to the phenomenology, the dialectical logic is not really formal and driven by necessity. Go to hegelcourses.wordpress.com for more exciting analyses of Hegel's philosophy. My name is Robert Veen, and you have been listening to Fragments of a Conversation about Hegel's Philosophy of Right, the introduction, paragraph 8 to 14.